You thought this planet was defenseless, that you were hunters.
Earth, a biological trace has been detected, but that's impossible. She has to be dead.
You didn't leave. You took us with you.
The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of cracked earth and dunes that shifted under the pale glow of the moons. No water, no life, just a wasteland, ancient and unclaimed. The air shimmered with dry heat, distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage. It was the kind of place that had been dead for so long, it had forgotten what it meant to be alive. The Viserith descended through the upper atmosphere, its vast metallic form cutting through the thin, dust-laden sky. The ship was a masterpiece of engineered conquest, a fortress of war that had razed dozens of worlds without resistance. Its hull gleamed with organic plating, pulsating with the energy of its living core, while spires of obsidian black metal jutted from its underbelly, prepared to deploy legions of warriors. From the command bridge, Commander Zuur-Ra watched the terrain below with quiet, calculated interest. He was not a creature of emotion. No one in his species was. Fear, hesitation, uncertainty. These were foreign concepts, irrelevant to beings crafted for expansion and dominance. He analyzed, he calculated, he acted. That was all. This world is fragile, Zuur-Ra said, his voice a rasping blend of vocalized clicks and sharp syllables. No planetary defenses, no orbital resistance. Its species are scattered, primitive. Vrashni, his second in command, inclined his head in agreement. The reconnaissance probes reported no threats. The dominant species rely on rudimentary weapons. They are centuries from interstellar capability. Zuur-Ra turned from the viewport. Prepare the landing units. We deploy in the first cycle. The Viserith slowed as it reached the surface, its shadow stretching across the dunes. The ground below vibrated, the ship's immense weight causing the cracked earth to groan in protest. A sequence of hisses and mechanical clicks echoed through the ship's interior as landing gear extended. The vessel touched down, displacing sand in waves of displaced heat. The silence that followed was absolute. Zuur-Ra listened through the ship's external scanners. He expected the usual reactions, the panic of local life forms, the futile attempts at resistance, the primitive communications scrambling for help. Instead, there was only stillness. The air itself felt too empty. He narrowed his secondary eyes, studying the readings before him. The biological scanners swept across the landscape, sending deep pulses through the terrain. They returned readings of dry rock, ancient minerals, and traces of long-extinct life. But something else pulsed back, something deeper, buried beneath layers of hardened sediment. A tremor. At first it was slight, barely enough to register as movement, but then the vibration intensified, rattling the command bridge. The hull beneath them groaned. Zuur-Ra turned sharply to Vrashni. That was not seismic activity. The second tremor hit harder. This time it was accompanied by sound, a deep, wet resonance, like muscle being pulled taut over bone. Vrash's knee stiffened. Something is moving beneath us. Before Zuo-Ra could issue an order, the ship lurched violently to one side. Metal groaned, alarms blared, and the lights flickered as the landing gear sank. No, it was being pulled down. A sudden, violent rupture split the ground beneath the Vaserith's underbelly. Sand and dust erupted into the air, mixing with a sound that was not wind, not rock, but something alive. The ship trembled as the hull buckled inward. Zuo-Ra moved swiftly to the primary control console. All units, defensive positions, we are not alone on this world. The external monitors flickered as the desert floor ripped open beneath them. Something enormous, something old, was stirring beneath the sands, and it had noticed them. The Vaserith's hull screamed as the ground beneath it gave way. A sound like wet muscle tearing away from bone reverberated through the command deck as metal plating warped inward. Warning lights flickered across every control panel. The air inside the ship turned electric with the tension of warriors who had never known fear. Outside, the once solid desert floor ruptured like torn flesh, sending fountains of sand and pulverized bone into the air. Something was rising. Something ancient, something that had been waiting. Zuo-Ra acted immediately. Deploy combat units. Secure the perimeter. Vrashni relayed the order, his voice cold, his movements precise. The Vaserith's lower hatches peeled open, spilling forth squads of warriors, elite, bio-augmented, engineered for planetary conquest. They hit the ground with precision, their weapons primed, their exoskeletal armor shifting to match the environment's heat signatures. But the environment wasn't stable. The first soldier barely had time to react before the sand beneath his feet liquefied. A limb, if it could be called that, erupted from the ground, a writhing mass of dark, sinewy flesh, layered in something between calcified bone and raw cartilage. It coiled around his legs, snapping his armor like brittle glass. The warrior let out a sharp, insectile click of distress as he was yanked downward, disappearing into the shifting earth in less than a second. There was no body left behind, only the impression of something having pulled him apart beneath the sand. Another tremor, then another. The land itself moved, rippling like a carcass shifting under the weight of parasites. Zuo-Ra's secondary eyes flicked to the bioscanners. The readings had changed. The once lifeless terrain was now pulsing with biological signals. Too many to count, too fast to isolate. The numbers on the screen swelled as more things, beasts, abominations, began surfacing. The ground opened again, vomiting forth the first of them. It was not an animal. It was not a machine. It was a mass of impossible anatomy, an amalgamation of twisted limbs, jagged exoskeletal plating, and shifting muscle wrapped in something translucent and wet. Where its face should have been, there was a gaping maw of writhing, finger-like tendrils, each one tasting the air, sensing the heat of the warriors nearby. And then it moved. It did not lunge, it flowed, bending in ways a solid thing shouldn't, its torso twisting in midair like something was pulling it in multiple directions at once. A warrior fired his plasma rifle directly into its center. The shot ripped a hole straight through it, burning through layers of shifting organic tissue. The hole sealed itself before the warrior could fire again. Then the thing struck. A second limb, this one serrated with rows of twitching chitinous barbs, lashed out and pierced straight through the soldier's torso. The warrior let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but something worse, a bubbling, strangled gurgle as his body convulsed. Zuo-Ra's enhanced vision caught it all in perfect clarity. The limb wasn't killing him, it was changing him. The warrior's veins blackened, his chitinous armor cracking from the inside as something beneath his skin fought to break free. His arms shuddered, lengthened, twisted. His mandibles melted into his face, reforming into something unrecognizable. His body began to split open down the center, not from injury, but as if his very biology was rejecting what it had once been. Then he turned and fired on his own squad. The plasma shots burned through two of his former brethren before they had time to react. His movements were erratic, unnatural, as if his body had become a puppet of something buried deep inside him. More of the creatures erupted from the desert. Some were bigger, their forms warping in real time, splitting open and reshaping with every step. Others moved with grotesque precision, mimicking the warrior's own movements before lunging in unnatural bursts of speed. The Viserith's forces fought, but it didn't matter. The creatures absorbed everything thrown at them: energy blasts, thermal detonations, even the reinforced blades of the close combat units. And each attack made them stronger, their bodies adapting, consuming, twisting. A horrifying realization sank into Zuo-Ra's mind. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to survive long enough to retreat. Vrashni's voice cut through the carnage. "Commander, we need to fall back." Zuo-Ra's mandibles clenched. He hated retreat. It was not in his nature. But this was no ordinary conflict. This was not war. This was a feeding ground, and they were the prey. "Pull back to the ship," he commanded. Vrashni relayed the order, his voice sharp with urgency. The surviving warriors moved swiftly, their discipline preventing complete collapse into chaos. The fallen were left behind. There was no retrieving them. Their bodies were no longer their own. The desert pulsed beneath them, a living thing, breathing, shifting. More creatures dragged themselves from the depths, some half-formed, their bodies still knitting together as if they had been waiting to be called. The warriors reached the Viserith's entrance just as the first tendrils lashed out toward the ship's hull. The beasts were learning. They were hunting, and they would not let them leave so easily. The Viserith's external doors slammed shut the instant the last of the warriors made it inside. The ship's hull shuddered as something massive collided with it, a sound like flesh meeting metal, wet and insistent. Alarms blared through the corridors, warning of external compromise. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt ozone and scorched armor plating, the remnants of plasma fire still clinging to the warriors who had barely escaped the maelstrom of shifting horrors outside. Zuo-Ra scanned the ranks. Too few. The Viserith had deployed a full planetary invasion force, but now, barely a fraction remained, and those who had survived. He narrowed his gaze, taking a slow step forward. Something was wrong. The warriors stood at attention, but their postures were off, a slight tremor in their limbs, their exoskeletons flexing in ways that seemed unnatural. Their breathing was shallow, irregular, the mandibles of some clicking out of sync, as if their own bodies had forgotten the rhythm. Zuo-Ra turned to Vrashni. Status report. Vrashni exhaled sharply, his form rigid, his secondary arms gripping his weapon tighter than necessary. Casualties too high, tactical failure, we cannot sustain. A violent spasm cut his words short. His entire body convulsed, his exoskeletal plating rippling as if something beneath it was moving. The other warriors twitched in unison. Zuo-Ra took an instinctive step back. Too late. Vrashni screamed, a sound that wasn't his own, a sound that shouldn't have existed. His armor split down the middle as his body twisted, stretched, reshaped. The limbs that had once been his arms elongated, distending into tendrils of slick, muscular tissue, while his torso peeled open like a splitting cocoon. Zuo-Ra reacted instantly, his plasma blade igniting as he slashed downward, severing what was left of Vrashni's shifting form before it could finish becoming whatever it was becoming. The thing that had once been his second in command collapsed, twitching, its flesh still shifting, trying to pull itself back together. He turned to his warriors and realized the infection was not isolated. Across the command bay, warriors began changing, their bodies rejecting the laws of their own physiology. Some collapsed to their knees as new limbs tore their way out of their backs. Others choked on their own screams as their internal organs twisted, relocating beneath freshly grown layers of alien muscle. Zuo-Ra felt it too. A creeping sensation along his spine, a pressure inside his bones, like something breathing beneath his skin. They had not escaped the desert. The desert was inside them now. A warrior lunged at him, its body half-formed, its original features barely recognizable beneath the glistening mass of shifting anatomy. Zuo-Ra drove his plasma blade through its chest, but the thing did not die. It split apart instead, dividing like raw muscle tearing down the middle, reforming into two grotesque versions of what had once been one warrior. Zuo-Ra knew then that they could not win. He activated the emergency override. The Viserith's engines roared to life. The ship lurched upward, tearing away from the surface as the creatures screamed in unison, an otherworldly chorus of rage and hunger. But the battle was no longer outside. It was inside them, and it was just beginning. The Viserith tore free from Earth's atmosphere, leaving behind the shifting, pulsing nightmare of the desert below. The ship's engines roared, pushing it toward the void, toward safety, toward anything that was not this. Zuo-Ra staggered through the dim corridors, his mind racing. The ship was still intact. The hull was holding. The creatures, those things, had been left behind. He repeated those facts in his mind like a chant, a desperate tether to sanity. But no matter how many times he said them, he knew they weren't true, because he could still hear them. The sound was not external. It was not outside the ship, clawing to get in. It was inside the walls, inside the air, inside them. He reached the command bridge, his vision blurring for just a second. His second eyelids flickered over his sight as he struggled to focus. His limbs felt heavy, wrong. The air tasted thick, as if it had gained weight, pressing down on his carapace. He exhaled sharply, trying to center himself. Focus. The ship's systems flickered. Emergency lights pulsed along the walls, painting the corridors in alternating flashes of red and darkness. Every bioscanner displayed anomalies, readings that made no sense, pulses where there should be none, movement where only air should exist. Vrashni was dead. His warriors were dead. So why did the Vaserith still detect them moving? A whisper skittered along the ship's internal speakers, a garbled, wet sound, as if something was breathing too close to the microphone. The controls at the bridge pulsed, their organic plating shifting beneath his claws like the soft tissue of something alive. He turned sharply. The command bridge was not empty. At first, he thought it was one of his warriors. A survivor, but the shape was wrong. The figure stood too still, its form hunched, its back twitching in slow, unnatural pulses. The armor was still Vaserith made, but it no longer fit the thing inside it. Zuor-Ra's mandibles tightened. "Identify yourself." The figure did not move. Then it twitched. Not a step, not a breath. A twitch, as if something inside the skin was waking up. Then it turned. Zuor-Ra barely suppressed the instinct to recoil. It had his face, but not him. The features were stretched, pulled over a frame that no longer matched its original form. The jawline had cracked at an unnatural angle. The mandibles had elongated into something needle-thin and wrong. Its eyes were black. Not empty, not lifeless, but full, overflowing, swollen with something that stared back at him. And then it smiled. Zuor-Ra's hand moved to his weapon. Too late. The thing lurched forward in a burst of unnatural speed, a flicker of movement that should not have been possible in something that still looked vaguely like him. He barely dodged the first strike, but the second cut through him. Not a blade, not a claw. Something softer, sharper, deeper. A tendril of flesh coiling from its own splitting ribcage, tipped with jagged cartilage that burrowed into his exoskeleton like teeth sinking into prey. Pain lanced through him, but pain meant nothing. He had been bred to resist pain. He would not falter. He could not. Zuor-Ra tore himself free, the sickening rip of flesh separating from flesh filling the air as he stumbled backward. His claws met his plasma blade, and this time he did not hesitate. The blade sliced through the thing's torso, severing it in half with a sizzling burn of liquefied tissue. It fell, but did not stop. It did not stop. Zuor-Ra watched in horror as both halves began moving independently, pulling themselves toward each other, regrowing, reshaping. The whisper returned, but this time it was inside his head. Not words, something deeper, a presence, a pressure, a voice that had no mouth to speak with. "You took us with you." Zuor-Ra gasped, staggering backward. His vision blurred again, his secondary arms shaking against the console as he tried to steady himself. The bridge pulsed, the walls, the floor, the ship itself throbbing like a living organ. He felt it, deep inside, buried beneath his bones. He was not alone in his own body. He turned to the navigation panel, desperate, seeking one last option. The ship was on course, heading straight toward their homeworld. Number. His claws slammed against the controls, overriding the coordinates. He had to stop it. He could not take this infection to his people. He would rather. His fingers froze. His own arms were moving against his will. He looked down and saw the chitin of his hands cracking, splitting. something wet and glistening writhing beneath the surface. "It will be a beautiful homecoming," Zuor-Ra screamed. His voice was not his own anymore. The Visereth never reached its homeworld. It drifted deep into the void, its course unaltered, its distress signals unanswered. A silent vessel carrying something that was no longer its crew. It would be found one day. And when the doors were opened, something inside would be waiting.